why viruses are not considered alive, even though they can infect people, but it's because of all of these types of things. So that video is only optional, you don't have to watch it. If it says the word optional, it means it's not on the study guide. I will be posting the study guide because I switch it up every year a little bit, and so I retype some of the things and change some of the wording for stuff, and I'll be doing that for you guys right after I get back to the office. Well, actually, we have to go pick up Vinny, and then when we come back to the office, I'll go and finish that up before I have a meeting at 4, and so I'll send it out to you, and make sure that you have all the copies of everything. But if it says this, it's only if you need it, it's not that you have to watch it. If it doesn't say optional, you will have to watch it because those questions will be on the study guide. Sometimes we get to it in class and sometimes we don't. If we get to it in class, sometimes we get to do some extra credit here and there for it. But again, that's not always going to be feasible, especially as we go faster in the future. So these are going to be some of the things that define life. There's going to be certain types of characteristics that we'll go over. Let me just tell you though, there's a total of 7 because on the study guide I always ask, which ones would not be. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it's going to be 5, 6, and then 7. So there's going to be a total of 7, but they're not all on the same slide. So as I go through, I'll tell you the number, but just make sure that you know it's not just on one slide if you go backwards. All right, so again, we're just going over definitions of life today, some of the things regarding DNA and RNA, what's the difference and things like that, where they think life began, with under which conditions and stuff that we'll be discussing again in the future too. So cellular organization is going to end up being the first one. So this, make sure you have the definition down for it. So it's considered when all organisms consist of one or more cells which are surrounded by a membrane that separates it from living things. Again, it's when all organisms consist of one or more cells which are surrounded by a membrane that separates it from living things. And again, I'll just keep on saying it. So cellular organization is when all organisms consist of one or more cells which are surrounded by a membrane that separates it from living things. So again, you could be unicellular and have one, you could be multicellular like us, but we have a membrane that separates us. We're not just, a flowing pile of, goo. So we are going to actually have some type of a membrane that holds in the actual insides of the cell. Every single thing that's going to be considered alive has a membrane. Even bacteria have membranes. So that's what they're trying to say, and there's going to be a certain organization about it. What decides what's a muscle cell, a brain cell, or anything else is what we'll discuss way in the future when we go into all the information on genomes and everything else. But for now, just know simply just what the definition is for that one. So order is going to involve a definition when it comes to the internal composition of your chemistry. So the internal chemical composition has to be different from the environment. So what you have inside of you is going to be different than what's outside of you. And so the certain chemicals you're made up of, which we will discuss in chapter 2, what the core chemicals are that make up your entire body. So again, the reason you're called a carbon life form is majority of you is made up of carbon. Yes, you have water in you. That's considered inorganic because it doesn't contain carbon. But again, everything else has carbon. All of your fats, all of your proteins, all of your DNA, everything is going to end up having carbon in it. So again, the internal chemical composition has to be different from the environment. So your body is going to be composed of different types of cells if you're multicellular, and they're each going to contain very complex molecules. And so it can vary, but in general, what you have in you is different from your surroundings. So you just might have some phosphorus and some nitrogen and nitrites and all that in the ground, but the way it's going to be composed inside you, inside your DNA, inside your fats and things like that, will be completely different. All right, so the third one is going to be sensitivity. This has nothing to do with your feelings, because obviously an amoeba is not going to have feelings. This has to do with all organisms respond to a stimuli. So if you are alive, if something happens to you, you will have a response. So in other words, if something is hot or too cold, you move your hand away. You have some type of response. All living creatures, even bacteria, do the same exact thing. They're not consciously thinking of it, but will automatically occur. And so, yep.
What's like reaction?
Completely reaction. So there's always going to be some type of reaction to some external or internal force that's going to end up happening. So something is going to react. So all organisms have to respond to stimuli. So it has to do with this principle of causality. So in other words, plants grow towards light because they're going to need light for photosynthesis. And so, bless you. So they have gravitrophism, which makes the roots go down, but at the same time, they also are going to have phototrophism and move towards light. It's technically the word they use. But again, all organisms are going to respond to stimuli. So all plants are going to end up growing towards light for that particular reasoning. And so again, they will respond to a stimulus in some way, shape, or form. So you are going to end up having some type of growth, development, and reproduction if you're going to be alive. So again, growth and development doesn't mean you're going to grow big. Even if you're unicellular, you are still going to have to be slowly splitting off and doing some type of binary fission or mitosis, or still, splitting into two. You still have to grow that membrane. You still have to replicate, with everything inside the cell. Growth is going to start from a tiny little zygote dot, and then you're going to grow bigger, eventually into a fetus, and then obviously into a baby once it's born. So reproduction can be done with sexual, which we call with gametes. So that term you're going to learn a lot when we get to chapters 10 and 11, but for now, just in case you don't know the spelling of it, so this is going to be for gametes. Anything involving sex cells, sperm, egg, or anything like that, this is what we call it. So this is the scientific term for it, is gametes. If you're doing sexual reproduction, you have to have this. Even ferns have it. Like literally plants outside, any of this stuff has it. So they're going to end up having megaspores and microspores if you're dealing with plants. With ferns, they would have Archegonia, Antheridia. They're going to have like all these like different names, but this is what they produce. So either they're going to have gametophytes, which are haploid, and they're going to do it if they're going to be moss. It's not just humans, and it's like putting egg and sperm together. So other things do this as well, but not everything does sexual reproduction. Some things do not. Bacteria do not. They do something completely different, which is a form of asexual reproduction, which would be things like binary fission that you'll learn about again in the future. If you see the word a in front of something when it's referring to a Latin word, it means without. So sexual reproduction involves gametes, sex cells. This literally means like without sex cells, so it's not going to have anything like that. So think of cloning. That would be the closest thing to asexual reproduction. So when you are going to make a carbon copy of something, everything's the same, all the DNA is the same, everything inside is the same, back to asexual reproduction. A lot of plants can do that. We cannot do that. So we do not have that ability. So you can't chop off one of our arms and grow a whole new person. Technically, we have stem cells, yes, and you can, there's something called totipotent. Don't worry about the definition or the wording, but some things that are in the early stages of development can technically turn into anything based on the instruction sets you give them. That's what genetic engineering is. But if you are going to end up going and doing like something that would be considered asexual reproduction for us, there is nothing. So plants like dandelion roots, if you cut them, you can actually grow an entire dandelion fresh new from it. These things are called suckers, and you can do it that way. But my point is, we can't do this, but some organisms only do this. Conjugation is something very different that only bacteria could do. So just make sure if you see the word conjugation, nothing can do it except bacteria, and that's it. And so this is going to involve something called the plasmid, which you don't have. So if you are a bacteria, and then you're going to end up having another bacteria, you technically have some DNA. It's going to be circular. Yours is not circular. So they're going to end up having the circular DNA that's going to be inside of them. We have DNA too, theirs is just structured different. What they also are going to end up having is something circular called a plasmid. They can actually touch each other with these extensions that they end up having and literally send the information one to the other. So conjugation is something only bacteria can do. You can't touch fingers with each other and share DNA. That's not going to work. So you're not going to suddenly inherit something from them. This is how bacterial resistance to antibiotics happens. To be completely honest, they have very high mutation rates, and then, I'm just getting an eraser, and then what ends up happening is if a mutation occurs and they have a plasmid that is now not going to be effective against any type of antibiotic, if it is then shared with another bacteria, you are screwed. And these things can go from one bacteria to 1 billion bacteria within 24 hours. So that's the problem. They reproduce extremely fast and they have abilities that we cannot do. But since they can share DNA, it's still considered some form of reproduction. So again, you have asexual, sexual, conjugation. All three of these just have to do with some way to do an inheriting of the DNA. So your DNA is your instruction sets. If you can go and inherit instruction sets, you can make a new copy of whatever you need to make a new copy of. So if you see the term heredity, it just means how something can be actually inherited via DNA. And so we will go into all the structures of DNA, multiple chapters on DNA, and a lot of people I converted last year from being normal engineers into bioengineers, where, by the way, that's where the money is. And a lot of scholarships right now, too, actually, especially with NYU. And so you will go into all of that, and we'll cover all of that and just explain how all of that works, especially in genetic engineering. So this is going to be the fifth one, so energy utilization. So if you are alive, you have to get energy. Without energy, you are not going to survive. So there's going to be multiple ways, especially for bacteria, but we're only starting with the general two for every single living organism. You are either in one of these two camps, and these are the definitions for them, so they're there for you. So autotrophs make their own energy, and then they can break down that energy, those molecules, to get whatever they need. We have to eat something, so we have to ingest something. That's going to be us. We are heterotrophs. Autotrophs would be things like plants. So those plants outside do photosynthesis, they create sugars, then they can actually break down the sugars for energy. We can't make the sugars. We have to eat them. We have to eat the fats. We have to eat the proteins. We can't just make them. So they have an ability to be self-sufficient, so that's why they're called autotrophs, because they can make their own cells like their sugars, and then they can go, not cells, sorry, they're actual compounds like sugars and break them down for energy. That's what chapter 7 will eventually be about, is how it's broken down. That one you're going to be getting probably a lot of recordings for, because that one can be quite difficult. And if you learn it and you get it down pat, it's probably the hardest in the whole book. And once you're done with that, the rest are actually really not that bad. So as for the heterotrophs, again, that would be you. So you have to consume something and break it down. So energy utilization has to be done, but it has to be done in at least these two general categories. There's many different types. There's going to be photoautotrophic, chemoautotrophic. There's going to be regular heterotrophs. There's literally chemo-photo-heterotrophs. It's like crazy. So there's different categories, but we're not doing those now. So that will be for way in the future. All right, so this will be number 6 and 7 for what defines life. So evolutionary adaptations, what this means is you will end up having, due to mutations. Now, mutations happen every 100,000 cell divisions. If those mutations are then inherited to the offspring, they will be able to go and still have those same adaptations eventually arise by pure chance of the draw. And so, again, this can due to certain environmental pressure sometimes. Like, let's say you happen to have a certain by chance mutation that occurs. It will eventually lead to an offspring that will have a different coat color. Maybe that coat color is preferable to the area it's in. It's not that it survives, it simply reproduces more now because it's not found. Maybe it's protected because now birds can't see it. So now it will be able to reproduce more, and now it will be able to go and pass on what we call its progeny, its young. So survival of the fittest was never said by Darwin, ever. What fit means is that it can reproduce the most and produce the most progeny, offspring. So if you ever hear the word fitness, it has nothing to do with someone's physical ability. It actually has to do with how someone's actually able to reproduce. Which makes sense. The more you reproduce and pass on your hereditary information, the more that you are putting that adaptation into the community. And so that's what can happen if you are alive, is you have these mutations happen by pure genetic chance, and you end up with all different things happening. For example, we all come from the lobed-fin fish. Every single one of these are different adaptations by pure genetic chance that happened over time, but they all came from the same thing. So the lobed-fin fish is your ancestor way back that even had a false lung for a fish. It can actually go on land, use its swim bladder as a false lung. That's why they're also called lungfish. And they were actually able to go and, by pure genetic chance, some had mutations. That led to amphibians. Those amphibians went and had mutations. You ended up with reptiles. Then from the reptiles, you ended up with mammals and birds. And again, by pure genetic chance. So evolutionarily speaking, that's the order they went in. And all of these, what we call the phalanges and things like that, are just going to be from the initial same thing. The way they know this is the genes. The genome projects have changed everything now. So we are starting to learn molecular clocks, who evolved when, who's related to who. It's changing all of the, what we call phylogeny of who's related to one another. That's why your book gets almost rewritten every year. That's why there's no point to even having your school buy them, because they would have to buy new ones every single year. So I am your book right now. So I'll just tell you that things are changing. And so again, you have to have change if you're going to be a species and considered to be able to have these adaptations. Now, homeostasis, not everything does this exact where you're staying the same temperature consistently. Like yes, adults, we're staying around 96 degrees or so, 97 degrees for females. Usually still 97 to 98 degrees for males. For children, much higher temperatures because they have the higher heart rate. They're going to have, more blood moving around. They're smaller, so it's going to be a little bit different. Smaller you are, faster the heart rate. Bigger you are, slower the heart rate. It takes a long time to pump that blood all over you. So as for the homeostasis though, and it means to just kind of maintain somewhat internal temperature as much as possible. So again, we have an ability to stay the same temp. Let's say a reptile though, they're what we call poikilothermic, multiple different temperature abilities, but if they still go too hot, their enzymes would die. Too cold, their enzymes wouldn't work. Enzymes run your body. They control all of the chemical reactions. So if those don't work, animal's dead. But they might have a much larger range that they can handle than we could. Like if you put us down even to the 80-degree mark, we're going to have problems. Our body's not going to function. If you put us under 104, your brain actually literally starts to melt. That's why they tell you to go to the hospital, because you're going to have brain damage. Your brain's mainly fats. So this doesn't mean that everything maintains a constant temperature of 1 exact degree. It means it has a range it can go and handle it. So again, that's what homeostasis is. Yep.
Can different body parts have different temperatures?
Yes. Your core is always going to be warmer no matter what. If your core is warm, you're okay. So even if you get frostbite and you end up with black fingers or something else, you know what I mean, like some tissue death, there's ways to kind of, even if you remove it, there's ways to repair certain things. Nowadays, there's so many new things that have come out, but you'll still be alive at least. If this area gets too cold, you got a problem. So you are not going to be able to come back from it too well. Although if you're frozen, it's easier to revive you than if you're too hot. Yep.
If you get like frostbite in your legs or something, do you have to elevate your legs to get all the blood going back to your core?
Technically, yes. The only problem is you might lose the legs. But it's better than being dead.
Yeah.
So I would say yes. But unless you plan on going to Antarctica and being dropped off, you should be okay.
Right now.
Or don't be like me, where I used to surf a lot, and I used to go sometimes during the winter time, and some of our winters used to be much colder, and I became hypothermic because I was stupid and I should have worn my suit that day. I didn't. My legs were completely purple by the time I got out because I couldn't feel my legs, and yeah, so don't do that. So I might be really smart, but I do really dumb things sometimes. Everybody does. So as for how you have the organization inside systems, if we call it the cellular level, you have atoms, you have molecules, you have macromolecules going down. So it just means that this is the smallest unit if you're talking cellular level. A cell would be the highest level of unit. So these are always how it's going to be organized inside an actual cell. So the smallest things are atoms. I know you know atoms, the protons, neutrons, electrons. I know you know that. We'll be covering it again though in chapter 2. Chapter 2 will be very easy for you because you had chemistry. So you should thank Mr. Ricardo, or who did you have last year? Did you have some?
Ricardo.
It's Ricosi.
Rockovic.
Rockovic Mercado.
Ricosi.
Okay. Then you'll thank me then more this year. So, as for the protons, the neutrons, and the electrons, those will be your atoms. For molecules, that just means you have multiple atoms all put together and different elements, things like that. If you put a bunch of molecules and compounds together, you now have macromolecules. There's 4 main ones that we're going to be covering when we get to chapter 3. So you're not doing that now, but it involves just your DNA, your proteins, your fats, things like that. So that's when we'll be covering all of that. But as for going and doing the organelle level, that's literally the little tiny pieces inside. So I think you've done this in grade school probably, but when they discuss like mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum, nucleus, all of those are examples of organelles. We call them organelles because they're very tiny and they're inside a cell. So they're basically the organs of the cell. They're inside of there. So that's why we call them as such. What is that, the bad stupid thing? Yeah, well, we'll just talk over it. So as for going and having, again, the cell level, that would be the highest if it's cellular. If you're doing the organism level, and again, not everything is an organism. Like an amoeba is one cell, so it only follows this. We have tissues, organs, and organ systems, so we follow this. Not all animals do. Like jellyfish, they actually will only go and have tissues. And so they're going to end up having tissues and some organs technically. If you're going to look at sponge, they are only tissue, and that's it. So it depends on what animal you're looking at. And yes, sponge are animals. They're actually the first evolved animal that came to be, probably from chronoflagellates, which you will learn about this year. So again, as for tissues, that's the lowest level for the organism. Now, organs are made up of tissues, the organ systems are made up of organs, and then the organism is made up of organ systems. But again, that's not everybody, it's just that you are of this particular one. So, living systems, there's going to be difference at the population level definitions for these. These definitions, just make sure you definitely have them perfect. This would be the same definition in your book anywhere you go, and these will pop up everywhere. So if you take other biology classes, you will definitely be covering these. All right, so if you are going to be a species, this is going to be a group of a particular type of organism that can interbreed. By interbreeding, you are not having sterile offspring, you're having offspring that can also go and breed then technically. So again, a species is a group of a particular type of organism which can interbreed, shares similar DNA, and has some type of what we call analogous morphological features. In other words, they look the same. So usually if they're of the same species, they will look somewhat similar. Might not always have, we're all the same species, but we don't all have the same skin, the same everything, but we do have 2 eyes, we have 2 ears. We're going to have the same general features. We're going to have 2 legs, 2 arms. So we are still the same species, and genetically we're 99.9999 the same. So obviously there's going to be just a tiny bit of difference, always, never 100% of anything. So again, a species is a group of a particular type of organism which can interbreed, share similar DNA, and it has very much similar features. So we just call it analogous morphological features is the fancy term. So we will look somewhat the same. And so depending upon where it is, it might look a little bit different. Like obviously you're going to end up having different types of gorillas. You're going to have different types of birds. So even though a bird is a bird, it's in that class, it doesn't mean it's the same species because there are going to be a lot of differences. Yep?
Would it be depending on the environment?
Usually predator pressure, yeah, there's actually a whole list of things. If you take ecology, they go after all that stuff. And then they will tell you there's like these things called K and R selected species, and there's differences in those that can lead to all those types of things. But even chemicals, yeah, all that type of stuff. So external stimuli definitely can contribute to things, we'll just put it that way. So as for populations, so these are going to be groups of individuals of the same species, and they have to occupy a given area at a given time. So you kind of decide the population when it comes to something, because you could say the population of New Jersey, you could say the population of Bergenfield, you could say the population of Paramus, you could say the population of people down the street from you. You decide also the time span. You could say, I'm going to compare the population of people in New Jersey now to the people of 1776. Those are different populations because it's different times, even though it's the same location. So again, a population is a group of individuals of the same species which occupy a given area and a given time. So if you are of the same population, you must be of the same area and time. You, as a scientist, decide the parameters. So you can choose a very large population, like the United States, and you can say versus the population of China. Like you can use those terminologies based on how you want to use that information. So, as for a community, this is going to be every single possible species in a given area and time. So in other words, if we were going to be discussing a community of, let's say, what's in Junkerhook Park, you would say there's going to end up being all those different species of trees. So there'll be certainly white oak, black oak, red oak, scarlet oak. pin oak, they'll probably be Atlantic cedars, they'll probably be red cedars, they're going to end up being all different types, sometimes of willows that are going to be close, the aspen are almost all dead. They're going to end up having maple trees, so red maples, silver maples, there's going to be sugar maples. So those would be the different species, and you would count them, and it tells you the species richness. But that would be your community. Your community is every single species in a given area and time, but again, you decide the parameters. So am I only looking at that riverbed ecosystem, all the trees adjacent to it, or am I looking at the trees outside here? So you decide the place and time. But again, technically, a community is going to end up being all of the populations of different species, and they're going to be living and interacting in a given area and time that you decide. So again, it's all the living organisms in a given area. That would be the community. Ecosystem is different. So ecosystem is going to involve all of the abiotic factors that are going to be there. Again, that means technically without life. So think of the atmosphere, the soil, the climate, the water, all that type of stuff is considered abiotic. And again, remember I told you if it starts with A, it means without. So biotic means all the life components, abiotic means without life. So what you have is a community living in an ecosystem. So technically inside an ecosystem, you have both of these components because this is sitting inside of it. So again, if I'm going back to Dunker Hook, the water that's flowing, the different types, the salinity levels, all that type of stuff, that's going to be technically an abiotic factor in the ecosystem. The rainfall would be an abiotic factor. If you're going to have certain humidity levels, abiotic, soil, abiotic, rocks, abiotic. So all of that would be the things without life. They're not alive. It's just simply that you have the community living in there, so that's going to be the ecosystem. And so it's usually referring to the abiotic factors. So it's going to consist of these things living inside of it. So all the plants, the animals, the microbes, those are all these biotic, and all of the abiotic are all the physical things that are going to be there. So again, the atmosphere, the climate, the soil, the water, all of those types of things. So again, any questions so far? Are you guys doing okay?
Biotic is just animals?
Biotic would be animals, plants, anything alive.
Okay.
So even the microbes, like bacteria, even that would be considered too. Okay. All right. So now going into just the unifying theme, because again, this chapter is very random with some of the stuff they cover. So for the organization of life, we have something called the cell theory. Eventually, in chapter 4, we will go ad nauseum into the cell theory. But in general, this is something that everyone has now agreed upon. There's certain rules to it. I'm just going to give you the general term. So the ones that came up with this first was technically Anton van Leeuwenhoek. So he was one of the first, and Robert Hooke was the other one. You do not have to worry about the names for now. Eventually, chapter 4, you do. So what they did was they used microscopes. Technically, there's a guy called Schwann who did it too. They looked at animal cells, dead cells in cork, plant cells, and everything else, and they all realized that cells come from other cells. Yes, we know there had to be a precursor. We will go into that in other chapters of how they think that came to be with RNA turning to DNA and vice, from there. But all cells have to come from other cells. Spontaneous generation cannot occur. So you cannot just suddenly appear with, oh, there's a cell that popped out of nowhere, so that cannot happen. Since 4 billion years ago, again, we definitely had something interesting occur with the first RNA, which turned into DNA, which turned into an organism. But as for other than 4 billion years ago, as of right now, since cells have existed, cells have to come from other cells. We've never had spontaneous generation since, and they cannot replicate that within a lab. It just can't happen. So again, all cells have to come from other cells is the main part of the cell theory. And so we'll be discussing a lot of that in the future. The other thing is the molecular basis for inheritance for you to go and pass on the heredity has to be DNA. So DNA is going to be, again, what we've you've probably discussed back in grade school. It's your double helix. There's going to be all different types of base pairs inside of there. All the details of the different types we are not discussing today. This is for future chapters. But just know that your DNA is your building blocks of life. All your instruction sets are there. If you mess with those instruction sets, that's where you have things go wrong, or you're going to do it on purpose and genetically engineer something. But even when you do genetic engineering, you can never create genes from scratch. You can only manipulate them and put them from one organism into another. We don't actually know how to create genes. So we might be learning about the genome projects and learning what certain genes do, but there are so many thousands that we don't know what they do. So only a very small part is actually currently known. So DNA, if you take long strands of it and you are going to wrap them up on chromosomes, they're going to be genes. So genes are made up of DNA. Your entire genome means all of your genes and DNA instruction sets combined. That's what we call a genome. So it goes in order. So smallest, did you do something before? Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
About to ask.
Yeah, they make me keep track because last year, I don't know what happened. Well, maybe the flinging of the poo happened. But whatever happens, they told me one person at a time, so I'm like, okay. So as for, again, genes, they're going to make up your genome. Your genome is the largest structure that you're going to end up having. So these are technically the base pairs, but I'm not going to have you memorize any of this for now. You're fine. So it's just adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, but we'll be discussing it in a few chapters, and we'll go over it then. There's no point to doing it all now. So, yep.
So the genome is made up of the genes and DNA.
Yep. So when they talk about Human Genome Project, it literally means it mapped every single possible instruction set of what makes you you. They finished the mapping. It took them close to 30 years. We don't know what most of it means. So we just see A, T, C, G, all these connections, and we're like, oh. So we only know a very, very tiny portion of it. That's where a lot of bioinformatics come in, and biological engineering and things like that. Computers have just blown away all the things that we used to think would take time to actually do. Computers now do for us for the analysis, but we still have to tell the computer what to look for. So, and that's where we're stuck. Now, as for the origin of life, again, there's a few theories of where this began. Right now, hydrothermal vents still seem to be the winner. That's that dark oxygen we've been talking about. It seems under certain conditions, you can actually go and create RNA. RNA is a single strand of DNA. If you can somehow combine these two together, you have DNA. If you have DNA, you have the building blocks of everything. So without instructions, you can't create anything. But all hereditary information definitely comes from DNA. They think it probably started from RNA, probably within hydrothermal vents. Originally, they thought it was going to be within volcanoes, which again, technically was actually sounds with, we have some bacteria that actually live near volcanoes, bacteria that you probably never heard of before that we'll be discussing in the future. Again, I believe in either chapters 3 or 4. Actually, no, we'll be doing a little bit of it here, sorry. And that type of thing is what's leading the way to the current theories. But again, theories are rigorously tested models. It doesn't mean that that is 100% the proof, because you can't go back in time with a time machine to 4 billion years ago. So it's just, again, theoretical, technically. So the other thing we study to see how all the origin is and how old the species is developmental proteins. So there's certain proteins that all living things share, and so we can actually tell based on what they share which animal or which organism or which microbe had these things first and who evolved from what. Those molecular clocks are very, very confusing. We were only to discuss them a very tiny amount in some other chapters. But again, the development of something is considered, again, going to be done via proteins and with enzymes and things like that that we'll get into. But again, developmental proteins are shared among many things. Just like I was telling you, for creating your phalanges, for your fingers, it's going to be the same DNA, same proteins that are going to be controlled for the lobefin fish and for other certain types of mammals, some reptiles as well, and things like that, that have, you know, the ability to have something like this. So, we will actually probably get to that video today, but this is going to be, I think this is the last one. Yeah. So this is the last one for today, because like I told you, we're going to be going a little bit shorter in the beginning, then there'll be longer lectures eventually. So you're going to have certain hierarchies of what came first for certain organisms and then how they're classified. We're not getting to classification until close to the end of the entire year, but I just want you to know that there's these things called domains of life. Those 3 domains of life are going to be technically the things that there's going to be branching out, like different types of kingdoms within here, and then bacteria have all different types of organisms in them as well. But we have domain bacteria, domain archaebacteria, domain eukarya. So we believe that archaebacteria are very closely related to us. It has to do with many of their physical structures and how certain things work inside of them. But I'm not getting to that now. That's gonna be for the future that we'll be discussing this. I believe, again, it's going to be chapter 3 for that one. But bacteria were definitely the first thing, or it was going to be archaebacteria, but one of these. So it has to be some form of bacteria. Archaea just means like an ancient bacteria, so this is technically going to be things that also live in really weird places. Like hot springs, these things can live in, near volcanoes, these things can live in, hydrothermal vents, these things can live in, places that you would not think possible. They even live inside of you, but they do not cause disease. If they are in that domain, archaebacteria, they have never once caused disease in any mammals at all. We do not know why, we have no idea. That's another mystery that, again, you want a Nobel Prize, try to figure that one out, but they do not cause any disease. If anything, they actually help you digest food. So we cannot figure out anything about them yet. We only discovered them in the 1970s, and that was like by pure chance. And so again, they're what we call extremophiles. They can handle conditions, environmentally speaking, that nothing should be able to handle. So within Eukarya, that's where you belong. There's going to end up being a total of 4 kingdoms. So you're going to end up having the fungus kingdom, that we're going to cover this year. Plantae, that would be only if you took me for Bio 203, General Bio 2. Animals, we will not cover again. If you take me for General Bio 2, we'll cover that. And then there's going to be Kingdom Protista, we will cover that this year. This is probably the hardest one as well, because there's so many things inside of it. So all of these are going to have a very similar type of cellular structure as the beginning parts. They actually have organelles. They're going to have things like mitochondria. They're going to have a nucleus. These two don't. So they're going to end up having just a nucleoid instead, and we'll go into all their differences when we cover other chapters. But again, those two domains are very different from each other as well, but way different from what we have for these kingdoms. So all of these are eukaryotes due to their certain cell structures and stuff inside. Those are going to end up being different. So what I'll do is try to play the video that's on here. I have no idea how loud this is going to be because I don't feel like going and scaring myself half to death. So let's see. Oh, that was going to be very loud. So I can't really hear well out of my right ear, but I don't feel like going extra deaf from this thing. Alright, and let me see if he can get it.
1, 2.
So, the way I do this is I play this video. You will have enough time to finish the whole thing because it's going to be a total of 10 minutes. If you get every single question right, and what we do is use a number generator to decide who's going to have to answer the question. And if you answer the question right, every single one of them, the entire class gets a +5 on the test. So this is my normal way of giving extra credit. So it makes you pay attention. And if you watch these ahead of time, it helps you even more. But again, you have to take whatever notes you have, and anyone in the same row as you, you can definitely speak to, but only in the same row. And so if I called on you, Amia, anybody in this row would be able to go and answer. And so you just have to be in the same row. But again, I have a total of 8 questions. So, yep.
Am I allowed to join this row?
I would join one of the ones that has smaller amounts. Actually, no, you can join that row. That should be fine. Never mind.
So, Damien's also
We
allowed.
join their row? Or you have Sean and Damien.
I would say you're definitely with that row. Yep.
Oh, my bad.
Do we take notes on the video?
You can take all the notes you want in the video. So, but yeah.
Is the PowerPoint on?
Yeah.
recording
Yeah.
it.
Please, put it down also.
You should probably take some, just maybe some buzzwords.
You said that there are like 7 of the ones left. Which
Yeah,
ones
but
were those specifically?
So,
What's your name?
just go back up here with that.
No, I can enhance this.
This is gonna be 1, 2, 3, 4 on this slide. I'm just gonna show you the slides. So slides 2, 3, and 4. This will have number 5,
It's just,
and then 6 and 7. So slides 2 through 4 have them. So if you wanna make a note to yourself, slides 2 through 4.
You.
And this is gonna be for the first
I don't know what
paragraph.
this is.
So, Professor Snyder?
Yep.
What row or row would indicate this one?
Yeah, might as well. So,
Us.
us.
Wait till everyone has to get it right to get their credit.
No, she has to ask, like, you have to ask one group a question, right?
I will be choosing a particular person, and if they sit within that row, then the whole like group kind of, yeah.
And then if everybody gets all the questions right, we
Yeah.
And it has to come from that person.
Yeah.
That's
The way I-
definitely gonna
Because
be,
this
because
way
I
I
don't
save
have
on
any
paper
notes
and
now.
stuff. So we always just.
You can like look out, you look a little more studious.
Now you better log in to open.
You look a little more studious.
So you guys take notes and me and Julie will listen to the video.
Yeah, I'm listening.
She was, that boy was like, y'all about his business, never mind.
So now, somebody can take notes.
I'm gonna try to take notes. You should take notes. Or should I do it on my
I can't like.
And then I'm gonna do it on my laptop so I can like.
Disconnected from your community, searching for something more?
Nah.
Then you should ask your doctor about becoming a member of 13.
Take notes on your
Membership
laptop.
is
Alright.
an effect.
Yeah.
Oh, we're already
I was gonna start taking it.
Oh,
Experience that 13 has to offer while also helping your
I'm
friends and
taking
neighbors.
notes on like an ad, bro.
Yeah, I'm running right now, dog.
Try becoming a member today. Side effect. To be a member of 13, how do you feel? It's joyous. And more feeling that's on
Now is the time for you to become a
Oh
king.
my god, bro.
Says two. Only two.
One of the most significant events in our distant past is still perhaps the greatest mystery, the origins of life itself.
Why are you in a
How
tree,
did it
dog?
all get started? If you look down the evolutionary tree of life, you'll see that we mammals branched from reptiles, which branched from fish, and so on and so on, all the way down to the base of the tree. A common ancestor, some single-celled organism billions of years ago. But what came before that? And where did the very first living thing come from? Correspondent Chad Cohen digs down deep into the roots of the tree and uncovers some groundbreaking research into how life first began.
Everything on Earth that has ever lived came from an ancient ancestor billions of years ago. Perhaps a simple, single-celled organism like this. But from where did it come? From where did the first life emerge?
Life emerged from chemistry. After that, it's just details, right?
So at the root of the tree of life, it appears, is chemistry. Simple elements like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. But how did they get cooked together into the complex molecules of life?
We're here on the planet, and we must be here as a result of organic chemistry.
John Sutherland from the University of Manchester, England, along with co-authors Matt Powner and Beatrice Gerland. Gerland.
Okay.
He and his team took on the task of looking for the holy grail of life.
You know what you want to make, but you don't have a recipe.
We can all imagine what this is like. In the kitchen, we bring together different ingredients all the time to make all kinds of different things. It's the recipe, though, that makes it all work. Take, for example, the cream puff.
Oh yeah, pâte à choux.
Okay, pâte à choux as it's known in French. In this case, I know the ingredients. Flour, eggs, milk, water, butter. What I don't know is the recipe. So I might just try mixing all these things together. And baking them. I could try different orders, different combinations, different amounts. But what you get is not pâte à choux. Too brittle. Too hard. Well, I have no idea. Attempts to find the recipe for early life were unsuccessful too. Even though researchers knew the basic ingredients.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobel laureate Jack Szostak and his team at Massachusetts General Hospital say that early life needed two things.
You need the cell membrane,
A container, something to live in and keep other things out.
and you need some genetic material. Something that can allow the inheritance of information.
Every modern creature uses DNA to do that. It's an organism's instruction manual, genetic code, spelled out in chemicals inside this twisty double helix. DNA has long been hailed as the fundamental molecule of life. We also have RNA as well, usually described as DNA's helper. But now it turns out, RNA has a starring role.
Years ago, RNA was kind of a bit player in the cell. Now our picture is completely inverted. We think RNA is really the important thing.
RNA has a genetic code also written with chemicals, A, C, G, and U. They're used to help build the proteins that make up the cells in our bodies. Skin, hair, brain cells, the heart. RNA helps make them all. So what's the recipe for RNA? It's made from 3 parts: a sugar, a phosphate, and a single letter of the genetic code, a base. Each of these parts is made up of simple chemicals that existed on the early Earth. But nobody has been able to put them together. That is, until John Sutherland came along.
We were the guys who stood back and looked at it in a different way.
It's one thing to make chemicals in the lab, but there were no labs on the early Earth. So Sutherland tried to replicate the conditions, in some ways simulate what that Earth would have been like.
Simulate the actual chemistry that took place.
Starting with their version of what Charles Darwin suggested as the perfect spot for the source of life, a warm little pond.
The pond itself is actually the little round-bottom flask.
And because it was a warm little pond,
It's around about the temperature of a cup of English tea.
sounds nice. And so they tackled the problem at hand, trying to make RNA. Knowing what chemicals it would take, the question was how to cook them together. People have known the ingredients for some time now, but the recipe has not been really working out.
You actually have to be the person that writes the recipe book.
So that means we have to go back to the kitchen and try to combine our ingredients for pot au choux in a new way. Remember the ingredients: eggs, milk, flour, water, and butter. We combined them before with no luck. But now we have a real chef to help us.
Well, you had the right ingredients,
Right.
but you forgot one very important step.
We'll
It's
be
that
making a senior
intermediate
year
step.
in
Chef Richard
culinary
Collins of the Culinary Institute of America explains that I was missing an all-important intermediate step.
You didn't pre-cook the mixture.
I can't just mix these things
You
together
literally get to do
and make it.
No,
And actually-
because that's why you have this.
So pre-cooked, what does it mean to pre-cook something? Some of the ingredients need to be cooked together first. This is the intermediate step.
That you didn't do earlier.
Yeah. I first cook the water, milk, butter, and flour together. No eggs. Then,
Take it to the mixer. Now you can add the eggs.
okay, now, finally, okay. And you get just the right mixture.
All right, that's ready to be baked.
The result,
Wow, they look perfect. Without that intermediate step of pre-cooking, you really don't have pot au choux. It's not much of anything without that intermediate pre-cooking step.
right? And apparently, that was the problem scientists were having with RNA, trying to combine all the parts together. And that's not the way to do it.
No, it's not.
So Sutherland's team took their own intermediate step. First, they created a hybrid made of a sugar and only half of the base, the part that holds the genetic code. This intermediate substance came together in the flask through the simple process of evaporation.
It looks like a smear or a smudge on the inside of the flask.
On the early Earth, the intermediate would have formed through evaporation, made its way up into the atmosphere, and then fallen from the sky.
So this would come down in rain, or if the temperature was cold, it would precipitate out as solid particles and fall to the ground, almost like a kind of organic snow.
And as in the lab, meeting up with the remaining chemicals in perhaps another warm little pond, and attaching together in the final step. And it worked. For the first time, scientists created a building block of RNA, what's called a ribonucleotide, containing the base C. In hindsight, pretty simple.
It never occurred to me to try putting it together in a different order, so it was not obvious.
It was, in fact, an amazing accomplishment.
Because if you take the right mix of ingredients in the right order, with the right set of conditions, you can cook a nice piece of pastry. I can make a ribonucleotide.
And it came together in simple steps that could have taken place on their own on the early Earth.
My team and I have recreated an early Earth scenario and let it run. And the chemistry just does it on its own.
But that wasn't all. They took their piece of RNA and subjected it to something else easy to come by on the early Earth.
Light.
Yes, sunlight.
And so if you hit the switch, you'll see what happens when the sun shines.
Something amazing happens. The light shining upon their sample turns some of the C bases, the bit that makes up the genetic code, into U's.
So 2 for the price of 1, just by having the sunshine.
They had discovered a natural pathway to 2 of the 4 letters of RNA. Letters that code for the proteins that build all living things.
We were pretty happy, actually.
Understatement there.
No, they were happy. I would never say contrary, but in an English way.
We might have had a trip to a local pub.
And so, well, we're a long way from figuring out exactly how life got started.
They've really, I think, solved one of the central hard questions in prebiotic chemistry.
They filled in a piece of that mysterious underside to the tree of life. Because as we trace our origins by looking down, chemists like Sutherland are seeing things in a different way.
What you see looking down from biology is what we see looking up from chemistry, and we can actually establish a link between the two.
A pathway from simple to more complex chemicals until chemistry becomes biology. They've given us a glimpse of where we come from.
What were you gonna ask?
Have they found like the A and the G yet, or are they still working on it? Like,
Still working. So as of right now, they also had to go back to the drawing board because they realized, I'm just getting the number generator, because they realized that you can't actually do it under certain conditions that they were doing it under, so they have to change the entire thing again. So,
You getting the
but-
number generator or what?
Huh?
Did they figure it out eventually?
That's what I'm saying,
Wait,
it's
was
still
this
on the
supposed to
race
be-
to win a Nobel. What?
So they said that it had been like they were able to do the like chemical base to sugar.
Wait.
How would have the sugar gotten like if it were like here per se? How would have it been through sugar?
There's going to be certain bonds that work with nonpolar polarities, and they will have natural tendencies. You know how you learned like electronegativity and all the rest of that stuff? There's natural ways that they're going to want to bond together. So technically, all of those ingredients already had existed, but putting them all together to form the DNA to be able to pass things on, that's what was not previously done.
Oh, okay.
So, but technically the other stuff, there was some things around. It's just that they weren't all put together in something. And that was it. So, but they technically, like phosphorus always was here, you know what I mean? Like, things like that.
It was brain.
I'm just gonna find
RNA
this.
makes some hair skin. Brain is
Here we go.
hard.
So, I just can't put it on there, but let me put.
Skin out.
Alright, let's see. So we have, how many people here? 20, right? No, not 20. We have 19? 19, okay. So that's number 19. Okay. So
It's gonna like be the
then,
reason that they don't get the extra credits and everything.